Before the world knew which way history would turn, America stood at a quiet crossroads. A nation busy with work and hope, unaware that distant decisions and unseen movements were already closing in. Because on an ordinary morning, far from the noise of battlefields, the future of the United States was still unwritten, balanced on a few hours, a few choices, and a silence that would soon be broken forever. In the late 1930s, as Europe slid into war and Asia burned with conflict, the United States remained a nation divided between caution and responsibility, shaped by memories of the First World War and hardened by the Great Depression. And across the country, Americans focused on rebuilding lives rather than preparing for another global struggle, with factories slowly returning to work, farms recovering from drought, and families finding fragile stability after years of hardship. While President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched events overseas with growing concern, aware that oceans no longer guaranteed safety in an age of modern warfare, and although Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 ignited a war that would spread across continents, the United States officially stayed neutral, bound by neutrality acts passed earlier in the decade, and by public opinion that strongly opposed sending American sons to fight another foreign war. Yet, behind the language of neutrality, the administration began careful steps to prepare the nation, expanding the Navy, strengthening coastal defenses, and quietly supporting allied nations through policies like cash and carry, which allowed Britain and France to purchase American supplies if they transported them themselves, a legal compromise that kept the country out of direct conflict while recognizing the growing danger posed by Nazi Germany. And as France fell in 1940 and Britain stood alone against German air attacks, the sense of distance began to shrink, with radio broadcasts carrying news of bombed cities and civilian suffering into American living rooms, slowly changing the national mood from detachment to uneasy awareness. And in Washington, debates grew sharper, with isolationists warning that involvement would destroy American lives and ideals, while interventionists argued that democracy itself was under threat. And Roosevelt navigated this divide carefully, aware that leadership required patience as much as vision. And by 1941, the world situation had become more dangerous still, with Germany controlling much of Europe and Japan expanding aggressively across East Asia and the Pacific, having already invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937, committing itself to a path of military expansion that clashed directly with American interests, particularly in protecting trade routes and maintaining stability in the Pacific. And as reports of suffering in China reached American newspapers, public sympathy grew, yet official policy remained cautious, balancing moral outrage with strategic restraint. But tensions rose steadily as Japan sought access to oil, steel, and other resources necessary to sustain its military, much of which came from the United States. And when American leaders imposed economic sanctions and froze Japanese assets in response to continued aggression, the relationship deteriorated rapidly, turning diplomacy into a fragile and urgent effort to avoid war while preparing for its possibility. And throughout this period, American military planners faced a difficult reality, recognizing that if war came, it might arrive suddenly and without warning, especially in the Pacific, where vast distances and new technologies challenged traditional defense strategies. And Hawaii, acquired by the United States in 1898 and later developed into a critical naval outpost, became central to these concerns, with Pearl Harbor serving as the home base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, a symbol of American presence and power in the region. And while some commanders viewed it as a forward defense that could deter Japanese action, others worried it was exposed and vulnerable. Yet life at Pearl Harbor in 1941 did not feel like the edge of disaster, as sailors carried out routine duties, families attended social events, and the warm Hawaiian sun gave the impression of calm, even as global tensions tightened like a slowly drawn knot. And across the mainland, the nation prepared in quieter ways, with the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 introducing the first peacetime draft in American history, bringing young men into training camps not for immediate war, but for readiness. And factories began shifting toward defense production, though many Americans still believed these measures were precautionary rather than predictive. And in the fall of 1941, diplomatic talks between the United States and Japan continued, strained but persistent, with American officials insisting that Japan withdraw from occupied territories and respect international agreements, while Japanese leaders, facing internal pressure and strategic deadlines, weighed their options with increasing urgency, knowing that continued negotiations might only weaken their position. And behind closed doors, military planners in Tokyo prepared for the possibility of a decisive strike, believing that a sudden blow against American naval power could buy time and freedom of movement across the Pacific, while American intelligence, though intercepting some communications, struggled to piece together the full picture, limited by assumptions about where an attack might come and how it would unfold. And as November turned to December, warnings circulated through military channels that hostilities were possible, even likely, yet the exact target and timing remained uncertain, and commanders at Pearl Harbor were instructed to remain vigilant but not provocative, a difficult balance that reflected the broader national desire to avoid war, while recognizing that it might be unavoidable. And on the evening of December 6, 1941, Washington remained engaged in diplomatic exchanges, hoping for a peaceful resolution even as tensions reached their peak. And in Hawaii, the night passed quietly, with sailors writing letters, attending dances, and preparing for another routine day, unaware that hundreds of miles away, an enemy task force was already moving across the Pacific under strict radio silence, its mission planned in secrecy and precision. And as dawn approached on December 7th, the harbor rested under a calm sky. Battleships anchored in neat rows, aircraft lined up on airfields, and the sense of normalcy remained unbroken. Because in those final hours before history changed direction, America did not yet know that the future it believed was distant was about to arrive at its doorstep. And as the sun began to rise over Oahu, the first signals of what was coming were already in motion, just beyond the horizon, where engines turned and orders waited to be carried out. As the morning of December 7th, 1941 fully arrived, the calm over Pearl Harbor shattered when the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended from the sky, turning an ordinary Sunday into a moment that would define American history. And within minutes, explosions echoed across the harbor as battleships were damaged, airfields were struck, and confusion spread through ranks that had not expected war to arrive without warning. Yet amid the chaos, there were acts of discipline and courage as sailors moved to their stations, pilots attempted to take off under fire, and medics worked to help the wounded, all while commanders struggled to understand the scale of what was unfolding. And although the attack lasted less than 2 hours, its impact was immense, with significant losses to the Pacific Fleet and hundreds of American lives lost, but also with critical assets like aircraft carriers absent from the harbor, a fact that would later shape the course of the war. And as the second wave withdrew and the smoke began to clear, the realization settled that the United States was no longer on the edge of the conflict, but fully inside it. And news of the attack spread rapidly across the mainland through radio bulletins that interrupted music and Sunday programming, carrying words that stunned listeners in homes, diners, and train stations, uniting the nation in shock and anger. And the following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy, a phrase that captured the national mood and marked the formal entry of the United States into World War II, as Congress declared war on Japan with overwhelming support. And within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, transforming a regional conflict into a truly global one that demanded total national commitment. And almost overnight, America began to change, with factories converting to wartime production at unprecedented speed, producing ships, aircraft, tanks, and supplies in numbers never seen before. While millions of men and women entered military service, leaving behind civilian lives for training camps, shipyards, and overseas deployments. And the nation mobilized not only its industry but its society, with rationing introduced to manage scarce resources, war bonds sold to finance the effort, and communities reorganized around the shared purpose of victory. Yet the path forward was neither simple nor unified, as fear and suspicion also took hold, particularly toward Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens who had lived peacefully in the United States for generations. But in February 1942, Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, a decision driven by wartime panic and prejudice that would later be recognized as a grave injustice, even as Japanese American soldiers volunteered and served with distinction in units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, proving loyalty through sacrifice on distant battlefields. And as the war expanded, American forces faced immense challenges, beginning with early defeats in the Pacific as Japanese forces advanced rapidly, capturing territories and threatening vital supply lines, while in Europe, the United States joined Britain and the Soviet Union in a fragile alliance against Nazi Germany, coordinating strategy across continents, despite differing priorities and immense logistical obstacles. And slowly, the tide began to turn through hard-fought campaigns, with naval battles like Midway in June 1942 halting Japanese expansion and shifting momentum in the Pacific, while the Allied invasion of North Africa later that year marked the first major American ground engagement against German forces, signaling a long road toward the liberation of Europe. And at home, the war reshaped daily life, drawing women into factories and offices in roles previously denied to them, symbolized by figures like Rosie the Riveter. While African Americans pushed for greater opportunities and civil rights through the WWII campaign, seeking victory against fascism abroad and discrimination at home, and though progress was uneven and often resisted, the pressures of war began to challenge long-standing social barriers. And as American forces landed in Italy, stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day in June 1944, and advanced across France toward Germany, the scale of the conflict became clear in the letters sent home and the names reported in newspapers, reminders that victory came at a high cost. Yet determination remained strong as the Allied armies closed in, liberating occupied cities and uncovering evidence of atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, revelations that underscored the moral stakes of the war and reinforced the resolve to see it through to the end. And in April 1945, as American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin, Adolf Hitler died and Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending the war in Europe, though celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that the conflict continued in the Pacific, where fierce fighting persisted on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, battles that demonstrated how costly a direct invasion of Japan might be. And as planners considered their options, a new and powerful weapon developed through the secret Manhattan Project came into focus, offering a potential means to force surrender, but raising profound ethical questions. And in August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events that remain deeply controversial and complex in their legacy, but which led to Japan's surrender and the formal end of World War II, bringing relief and mourning in equal measure as soldiers returned home and families reckoned with loss. And the United States emerged from the war fundamentally transformed, its economy strengthened, its military presence expanded, and its global role redefined as a leading power in shaping the post-war world, helping to establish institutions like the United Nations and guiding reconstruction efforts through programs such as the Marshall Plan, while also entering a new era of rivalry with the Soviet Union that would define the Cold War. And as the years passed, the memory of the time when America's future was still unwritten remained etched in the national consciousness, a reminder that history can pivot in a single morning, shaped by decisions, sacrifices, and moments when ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary events, leaving a legacy that continues to influence the nation and the world long after the echoes of war have faded.